This is what we're going to cover in this fairly brief lecture on postmodernism. What is it? And then we're going to look at some aspects of it, listed there: intertextuality, truths, validity, post-colonialism, globalism, and of course then the end of postmodernism, because we're no longer in a postmodern world. Some people are calling it postmodern, and there are other different names too, and some of those we'll look at. So what is postmodernism? Well, last week's video we looked at what modernism is, and it's that modernism is that idea of, the individual being at the forefront and very much about what goes on in the individual's mind and, the experience of being human and these notions of truth. So postmodernism is actually broadening things out, and instead of just being able to have one particular viewpoint, so with modernism it was just a continuation on from previous movements and ways of thinking about the world, the postmodern world looks slightly back at all of the other things that we've already had. So it is almost like a taking stock, and it becomes almost like a pick and mix. We can choose which different aspects, which different theories that we find most engaging. So instead of it just being focused on the individual, it's actually really questioning, well, what is that notion of the individual, and which particular theory do we want to take on board, and how do we want to look at that? So one of the very easy ways to see and understand postmodernism is through architecture. So postmodern architecture has very much this idea of no longer having to just develop something new. Instead, we can go back and pick and choose things from previous times that actually we think, well, they would perhaps work well together. So the image that you see there on the right-hand side, that building in New York, that's one of our earliest and almost perfect examples of a postmodern piece of architecture. So we can see that the lower levels of this building all have very much that square, boxy, cube-like way that we saw last week when we were looking at modernism. So very much that truth to the material of concrete, square, boxy, quite rigid. But then we look at the very top of that building and we can see there is this strange, almost classical pediment that is almost a triangle that we would expect to see in sort of, Greek temples. But in addition to that sort of classical Greek triangular pediment, we have this strange cutout, this inverted arch. And, the arch was sort of invented by the Etruscans and then picked up by the Romans. So, still part of that classical world, but the Greeks didn't have it. So we've got a mishmash there of this sort of vaguely Greek-looking pediment, and then we've also got this strange Roman inverted arch, but then it's stuck on top of this entirely 20th century modernist cube-type building. So, it's this mixture. And then the photograph on the left-hand side at the top, that's the MI5 building in London, which again is a perfect example of a postmodern building, because we've got a mixture of what almost looks like an Egyptian pyramid going on at the top there, but also sort of vaguely at the top they look almost like sort of pediments that we might see Assyrian giant statues on, but there's also then that sort of round rotunda type of structure in the middle there, and then going down it looks very modernist, so again it's this real mishmash of styles and just putting things together because we quite like the look of it. And then at the very bottom, that is in Las Vegas, those particular structures, and it looks like a film set. So very much this idea of creating things that are not actually authentic, but instead are simulations of other things and of earlier times, and putting them all together. So that's one of the very strong elements of postmodernism, is this idea of simulation and created artifice. So we see it absolutely with a city like Las Vegas in America. So it's the perfect simulation of a city. And as you can see there, it was founded in 1905. It's often described as a grown-up version of Disneyland. But, there is nothing real about that city at all. It did not arise in an organic way. Most cities around the globe have rivers running through them because they were the earliest easy ways of actually moving goods around countries, and of course a source for water and for washing and drinking and so on. So rivers are very much were the lifeblood of most emerging cities and settlements across the globe. Vegas does not have a river running near it, and in fact the Hoover Dam was constructed some miles out of Vegas to ensure that this area in Nevada would actually have water. So it's completely created, and created as definitely a simulation, but a simulation of other places. So we can see from the photograph on the left there, we've got this is the strip, the main street in Vegas, and we've got part of, on the left hand side, one of the casinos, New York, which has, you might just be able to see on the extreme left towards the bottom, there is a simulation of Brooklyn Bridge, and it's not life size, and of course it's not real. And likewise, if you look over to the right hand side in that same photo, there is a version of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. So again, nothing actually real. This Vegas is a strange place where you can visit a version of Paris. 10 minutes later you can be in a version of New York, and then you can walk down the street and be in a version of Venice. So it's entirely constructed, very strange, but if you like that type of thing, very entertaining. The photograph on the right hand side is another casino called Excalibur, and that whole theme is sort of vaguely English, sort of European, but this notion of some type of medieval castles, and of course being called Excalibur, which of course was the famous sword of King Arthur, who was king of the Britons. So we have this idea of course also of England and Britain and the United Kingdom being interchangeable here, but this fakery again. And you can see from that image that we have on the left hand side of that picture the facade covering up all of the hotel rooms, which looks almost Middle Eastern, with this tall tower that almost looks like the prayer tower or the call for prayer tower of a mosque. But it's actually there to cover up one of the elevator shafts. So yeah, very much a case of faking things. And the entire structure looks as though it's been created out of Lego. And then of course we have the American flags flying in front of it, and also an escalator linking up to one of the drawbridges. So a very, very strange place, but definitely this idea of a simulation of a city. And that's absolutely sort of the ideal illustration of what postmodernism is about. This simulation, and things aren't quite what they seem. There isn't, or authenticity is not necessary for postmodernism. If we turn to looking at fine art, we also see, as part of this sort of move of postmodernism, we see this sort of broadening out of different types of art that are acceptable. And different things becoming coming to the fore, and breaking down these barriers between high culture and low culture. And pretty much the whole idea of postmodernism is that everything and anything is up for grabs. So this famous piece by Roy Lichtenstein, looks exactly like a cartoon cell, or possibly a couple of cartoon cells. If you've seen this, it is, or it was, on display in the Tate in London, in Tate Modern. And as I say, if you've actually had a chance to see it, when you get up close to this, you realise that in the same way that comic book cells, each of the squares with the story in it, how each of those are made up of inkjet dots. So this painting is also made up of dots, but you have to get up really close to see that. But it's absolutely this mixture of high culture and low culture. So high culture because this is a painting and it's in a gallery, in a very respected gallery, but at the same time it's what we might call low culture, sort of contemporary popular culture, certainly of the 60s, and of course the whole of the 20th century and into the 21st, of comic books. So very much again this sort of mishmash of styles. And it's not just that we have with postmodernism. We also have within postmodernism the rise of feminism, and taking in at least two more waves of feminism. So of course the first wave of feminism, and of course here we're talking about particularly feminism in the UK. First wave of feminism is the Suffragette Movement, post World War One, or in the run up to the First World War, and then absolutely it gains a foothold with the First World War, and then after that, some women in Britain begin to get the vote, and then of course that develops on. But so that's the first wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism is in the 1970s. And that's where, you may have heard the phrase about women burning their bras, which actually never happened, but, it makes a good headline. That's the 1970s, and that's the arrival of people like Germaine Greer and her very famous book, The Female Eunuch. And then we have the third wave of feminism, which is in the sort of the 80s and 90s, and that's in part people like the Guerrilla Girls, and also the whole idea of this girl power and the Spice Girls and sort of elements like that. Of course, there were legal changes along the way as well, with women getting more equality and more freedoms. And of course now we're in the fourth wave of feminism, but let's just focus at the moment on postmodernism. So feminism is on the rise with postmodernism, because postmodernism is about that mishmash of styles, that idea of everything being up for grabs, and that includes thoughts, theories, ideas. So it's no longer the case that, this idea that we have now is better than the idea that we had 20, 50 years ago. So, that was sort of that modernism was part of that continual move forward of now we have better ideas than we had before. Postmodernism actually reflects back on all of the ideas and picks out which ones which ones the individual actually likes and finds most resonance with. So we have a piece like this, which looks simply like a poster, but it's actually a piece of artwork, and it did appear in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And for those of you that have actually been into my office on campus, you'll know that I have not this particular poster, but I have another of the Guerrilla Girls posters actually up in my office. Because they were really thought-provoking and are thought-provoking artists. So another aspect that sort of comes in with this idea of everything being up for grabs and being able to take things from wherever you find sort of most resonance, we have this idea of intertextuality. So those of you that have studied English Lit will be quite familiar with this idea that we will often have passages in novels or in short stories or in poetry that actually have borrowed ideas and sections from or references to other earlier pieces. So, and this is what intertextuality is. It's these sort of echoes of other things. And quite often in postmodernism, we have sort of this being done for humorous reasons. So, postmodernism is also quite humorous. So we have here, as you can see, the top screenshot is from the video games The Simpsons Hit and Run, and the bottom one is from Grand Theft Auto. Now, if you've played both of these, you will probably have realised the echoes that are found in The Simpsons of Grand Theft Auto. So Grand Theft Auto came out first. Obviously, we're on to, what is it? We're on to the 5th or the 6th incarnation now, but we've had lots of sort of different versions of Grand Theft, set in different places and so on. And it's become, well, it was for a while very much the sort of the bugbear of society. So the media would have us believe that it was turning people into violent thieves, and it was a terrible game, and so on and so forth. Which there's an awful lot of research out there that you can read that points to video games not being responsible for violence in our societies. Not everything is perfect about video games, but it is not responsible for all of the violence. Human beings have been violent for a long time before the arrival of video games. But what's interesting here with The Simpsons is that this is a game aimed at children. There is no overt violence, shall we say. You sort of don't go around beating people up like you can in Grand Theft, but you do get to run people over, which is why it's called Hit and Run. And every time you run people over, so the coins come out of their pockets, and then that means that you actually get to pick them up. So, and as you can see there, you can be Homer. You can also, you can be all of the different characters and carry out this sort of trail of destruction. It's, of course, working on two different levels, as The Simpsons does. We know that The Simpsons is not just for children, and arguably it's never been for children. And instead, it's very much a satire on contemporary life, particularly in America. And likewise, we could say the same about Grand Theft Auto, that it's actually a satire on contemporary life in America. Even though Grand Theft Auto is actually a British game created by Rockstar North, who are in Scotland. At least in the early stages. So there's an awful lot of in-jokes, particularly in the earlier versions of Grand Theft, with the names of the shops and so on. So yes, it sort of appears to be set in America, but as I say, created by British a British company. So, as I said, jokes are a really big part of this intertextuality and sort of working on multiple different levels. So, and an awful lot of films and TV shows aimed at, ostensibly aimed at children, are actually aimed at wider audiences with lots of embedded jokes that parents will get and sort of older children will get. So we have something like here. So the GIF on the left-hand side, as you can see, is from Jurassic Park, the film that came out in 1993, and the iconic scene of the T-Rex chasing down the Jeep and trying to eat the people inside. And you can see that there's text on that wing mirror. Now, we don't have that on British cars, but on American cars, if ever you've been to the States, and particularly if you've ever sort of driven in a car in the States, you'll know that this is a common bit of text that's stamped on the mirrors there. Objects in mirror are closer than they appear. And that iconic scene was copied perfectly by the Toy Story franchise of films. So in Toy Story 2, as you'll probably remember, they've lost Buzz Lightyear, and he's ended up in the toy barn. So the toys go to retrieve him from there, and as they are travelling around, wandering around the toy barn at night, they come across the aisle where the Barbies are, and the Barbies, of course, are all having a party, but tour guide Barbie allows them to use her pink Jeep, and they all jump into that. And drive off to try and find Buzz Lightyear, but Rex, who is the T-Rex toy, falls out, and he chases after them, and he's sort of calling out for them to slow down. So and we know from the Toy Story film that he is not a scary character. He's very much a comedic character who is closer, perhaps, to Barney the dinosaur than the bloodthirsty T-Rex of Jurassic Park. But that same scene is recreated. And this is something that we see a lot in the Shrek movies, but we've also seen it in the Toy Story movies. It's something that is increasingly common in comedies, but not just for children, adult comedies too, but the children's comedies do this so that it broadens out the audience. And of course, it's part of postmodernism. So we also have this idea that if we can pick and choose aspects, elements from previous ideas, previous theories, previous ways of living, that means that we have no more absolute truths. So that means that all truths, all ways of living are completely valid. Now, this brought about some extremely good things to modern life and contemporary living, because it meant that no longer was it the absolute truth that marriage and relationships had to be entirely heterosexual and heteronormative. So, that truth that had been in place, certainly in Britain, legally right up until the 60s, when the law on homosexuality was repealed. But that even though the law had changed, that didn't mean that people's opinions changed. So it's came out of that notion of postmodernism that anything goes, if you like, that all truths are relative. And so we've seen a huge shift in society for the better, to allow people to be who they are, and to love who they want to love. So That does mean, though, this whole notion of no absolute truths is that we have this plurality and these notions of equality, as the cartoon has there. The idea that, we're all equal. So yeah, it's one point of view that you're standing on my neck, but also the other point of view could be that's equally valid, that you're trying to trick me with your neck. So, having this notion that both views are of equal importance, which of course we know is not the case. And looking at this now, and that cartoon is quite an old one, we could very easily change some of the elements in that to comments about not being able to breathe. So this actually now, looking through the lens of 2021, this is an extremely dark depiction of those notions of equality that still hang around from postmodernism, and that notion of equality not actually being workable, because it's the world is not like that. Our lived experience often contradicts what the theory says should be happening. The theory says, and the laws say, that there are, that there is equality. But the reality is that people have not, attitudes and ways of living have not entirely caught up with that. So this notion very much that values are relative, and of course from postmodernism, this notion that every system of belief is equally valid, which is absolutely what we see in an awful lot of the press. And this is something that the BBC in particular is constantly being called out on. And the idea that the BBC has to be completely representative of all sides of the argument. But actually, we know that this is not a good thing, that there are some absolute moral values. Although, I'm saying that you may not agree. And of course, in a postmodern world, and even in a post-postmodern world, we can have that disagreement. But personally, I think once it starts to cross over into harming people, then that tolerance has to stop. We cannot be tolerant of hatred and violence. There has to be a point where we need to draw a line and say, no, this is not right. But this is a development out of postmodernism. Absolutely, values are relative. There were good people on both sides, as Donald Trump famously said. So are all views valid? Well, I would absolutely say that no, they're not. That views that deny people's existence and see people tortured and killed, I personally do not find them valid at all. But we also have this notion of capitalism and globalization that again is something that has developed out of the postmodern world. And both of these images at the top of this slide are art pieces. And I think the one on the left is either Barbara Kitzinger or is it Jennifer Holzer? Sorry, I haven't got the details on there, and I should have put the detail on there. But these are iconic. On the right, that's an iconic image of Mickey Mouse and Ronald McDonald from McDonald's, and the girl in the centre is from an iconic photograph taken in Vietnam. And this mixture of Americanization of the globe. So, as I've said, in the postmodern world, everything is equal. And Carl Sagan very famously said, the well-meaning contention that all ideas have equal merit seems to me little different from the disastrous contention that no ideas have any merit. And, that's the situation that we perhaps find ourselves in now. And, that clash has been coming to a head for a considerable time. So we're also in a post-colonial world. So we have the Coca-Colanisation of the globe as well. And whether this is true anymore, I don't know, but it used to be the case that there was only one country in the entire globe where you couldn't buy Coca-Cola, and that was North Korea. Coca-Cola is everywhere. And with it, an awful lot of, a bit of a mixed bag of outcomes. And certainly that notion of colonisation has not, as we know from British history and the Empire, has certainly not been a necessarily healthy one. And, is something that is coming out more these days. If the government will allow it, she says. But, we have to confront our history and realise that no one country is perfect, and everybody has some sort of dark unpleasantness, which is an understatement, around what larger or stronger countries have done to those that were not perhaps equipped in the same way to deal with people taking over, which of course is what colonisation was. But without getting into all of that, we're in a post-colonial world now, and that again brings with it an awful lot of complexities and problems. And, there are an awful lot of politicians, historians, social commentators that talk about this notion of the post-colonial world, and the difficulties that it brings with it, but also this notion of global companies and global advertising also brings with it thoughts as well. So we have companies like Benetton, who were an Italian knitwear company, and they've sort of expanded beyond knitwear for a considerable amount of time, but they have always been extremely outspoken about race, gender, sexuality, and problems facing the world in the 20th century and into the 21st century. So a lot of their advertising campaigns are quite regularly shocking. And this is done in part, of course, yes, to sell their products, but also to make people reflect on this notion of what the brand stands for. So this is something else that we've seen, is this mixing of companies who are driven by capitalism, to make us put our hands in our pockets and buy their stuff. But we have brand loyalty, and we're loyal to those brands that chime with our own personal values. And, again, that's something that postmodernism has brought us. So this was one of the very sort of shocking images that was used in an advertising campaign for Benetton. And this is a real photograph of a young man who was dying of AIDS. And this was this photograph came out, I think it was in the late 80s, and the world was very much concerned with and gripped by the sort of the plague that is sort of HIV and AIDS. And at that time there was little to none in the way of treatment. And there was also the idea that at that time that this was very much um, a problem that was linked to homosexuality. And a great deal of sort of right-wing commentators were saying that this was, a plague sent from God, it was a punishment, and so on. So that was a very sort of prevalent idea. So we can see in this image, and the family, of course, allowed this image to be used. We have what resembles quite closely a what's called a deposition um, photograph, well, not photograph, image. So if we look at paintings and sculptures from sort of the medieval era onwards, we have lots and lots of paintings, images, representations of Jesus being taken down off the cross. And, he's sort of very sort of emaciated, beaten body, on the point of death, or as he has died, um, being held by his family and friends. And these paintings and sculptures, these depictions are called depositions. So of course one of the most famous ones is called the Pieta, which is in Rome, and it's of Mary, Jesus's mother, holding him across her lap. And this photograph resembles that deposition idea, of Jesus and so on. Now that's been used by Benetton to draw attention to the fact that aside from Jesus and Christianity and so on, we have that idea of a young man who has died and what that meant for his family. And that's exactly what is being depicted here. And so, we have that same thing going on, and that realization that regardless of how this young man contracted AIDS and HIV, he is or was someone's son, someone's loved member of the family. So, that was a very, very shocking image. And of course, we know that, the AIDS pandemic still continues on. No longer a huge problem in certainly in the UK and in the Western world, but there are parts of the continent of Africa that still has a massive, massive problem, and millions and millions of people being wiped out by that. And as I say, this is something that Benetton absolutely wanted to draw attention to, so that people buying or wanting to buy whatever knitwear or anything that Benetton sells will be doing that in the full knowledge that this is a company whose moral values and ethics and so on that they agree with. So that's something that has continued beyond the postmodern, but sort of starts then. Now we do see postmodernism finishing, and it has an absolute point where it finishes, which of course is 9/11 in 2001. And it's at that point there is this realization that we cannot have that equality of ideas and values, because it ends up causing real problems. We have a clash of cultures, and we could say that that has continued on, that clash of cultures. That yes, of course, we had post 9/11, we had the war on terror, which has sort of trundled on endlessly. But then more recently, in January of this year, we saw in America again that clash of right versus left, with the storming of the Capitol. So We are seeing, certainly in America and arguably in Britain too, and other places where we've seen a rise of the right, we are seeing a clash of cultures and of ideas and values. And this is sort of the end of that postmodern period of plurality, and instead something new. So what about the future? Where does this take us? And as we've seen in the last week, the Mars rover, and not just the last week. I mean, of course, yes, it's been in the press this last week because they landed another rover or probe onto Mars. But we have this push towards space exploration and the realization that came a couple of years ago that there was once water on Mars. And at the same time, we have plenty of places around the globe, and not just in what we might term developing countries, but even in so-called developed and highly sophisticated countries where clean water is not available to everyone. Most notably, of course, in America, where there has been an ongoing problem with oil companies and so on, with some parts of America not having access to clean water. If you're not aware of all of that, do go and have a look at it and sort of find out more. And certainly as well, there are some companies that are tied up in this with the broader problem of clean water, most notably Nestle. So and there is perhaps no company in the world that is perfect, and an awful lot of them are perhaps less ethical than others. So that's become again something that we have to consider. We have to consider the situation that we are going out of our world to find new things, find new places, possibly to live one day. But is that because we have ruined this country with things like climate change? So the postmodern is very much about engaging with all of these different ideas, and that the world is changing rapidly right now, and in this postmodern world, so many different things are becoming political, and it's something that we have to consider if we are going to be writing about it. So, in summary, postmodernism absolutely develops out of modernism, but it's about the mashup essentially. And everything is up for grabs, anything goes. It can be bright, funny, irreverent, but it's also quite problematic. We see the end of colonialism in the postmodern world, but we also see the rise of globalism. And globalism, of course, has brought its own problems. And morality and ethics and ethical capitalism has become a complex subject. So absolutely, the postmodern collapses under the weight of different ideologies and the rise of technology. That, of course, is key as well. And that leads us into the digital age. And we'll be looking at that next week.